Thank you to everyone at the Colorado Foothills World Affairs Council for inviting me here, and thank you so much to all of you for joining me tonight on what I hope will be a very productive discussion back and forth. It's a very exciting time, as Joe said, with the UN Climate Summit coming up next week, the climate strikes around the world happening this Friday. But I am particularly excited to be in Colorado so soon after the governor has signed a raft of climate and clean energy bills and electric vehicle bills and has put Colorado on a roadmap to achieving 100% renewable energy by 2040. That is very inspiring. Thank you all. I am also delighted to read and learn that the climate lawsuit brought by 3 Colorado municipalities against Exxon and Suncor has just received a victory in court, a preliminary victory that will allow it to proceed. This is the lawsuit you may have heard of, where that alleges that these 2 companies knew decades ago about the impacts of their activities on climate change, but did not share that with the public or with policymakers. And finally, NRDC, I'm happy to announce, was very supportive of the recent decision by the Denver City Council and the mayor to set up a special office of climate action, sustainability, and resilience. So congratulations to everyone. Colorado is really leading the way here, and that's so important. Thank you all. As you know, and as we speak today, we are undergoing and experiencing a climate crisis the likes of which humankind has never seen before. Just a couple of weeks ago, we saw the strongest Atlantic storm to ever hit landfill on record. But last year in the continental United States, we experienced more rain and flooding than in the history of modern record keeping. I suppose they have excluded Noah's Ark from the records. Next, please. And following one of the worst wildfire seasons on record last year, the head of the U.S. Forest Service is warning that 1 billion acres of land throughout the United States are at risk of catastrophic wildfires like the one that hit California, Paradise, last year. Paradise Lost. Next. Yet we are also at the cusp of a paradigm shift in energy use, as profound as the shift from burning wood to burning fossil fuels over 2 centuries ago. But we have to accelerate that energy transformation at a speed and a scale that is unprecedented in human history. UN climate scientists tell us that if we can't cut our CO2 emissions and fossil fuel use in half by 2030, we won't have a chance of averting the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. So can we make that shift fast enough? That's the question. And based on my 30 years of working in China and my understanding of the evolution of that country into a world power, I am convinced that China stands at the center, the very center of a strategic crossroads on this issue. And with the US government stepping away from its leadership on climate change, the question is, will China save the planet? And that remains to be seen. Next, please. Next. When I first moved to Beijing in 1990, winter meant coal. The moment, and I see nods from folks who are there, the moment that the city government in Beijing and other northern cities turned on the heating system, which happened at the same day every year, regardless of the weather, the skies would darken and our faces and clothes would become covered with soot. We saw people stockpiling coal everywhere around the city for use in heating and cooking. And in the distance, I could see the smokestacks of 4 large coal-fired power plants, as well as, believe it or not, the world's largest steel mill within the city limits of Beijing. Next, please. When I started NRDC's China Clean Energy Project, which was the first international environmental NGO to do so, we were a shoestring operation. I used to joke that our office was basically one man with a cell phone. And now our Beijing office was the first, in which is becoming a global network of NRDC offices and experts working to save the planet. Next. Coal is the main reason why China is the world's leading emitter of greenhouse gases. Next. Though it's important to note that its per capita emissions are much, much lower than that of us here in the United States. Next. China's evolution from a developing country to a global force started to take hold in 2001 when China joined the WTO and became the world's manufacturing hub. And during that decade following that, China quadrupled its GDP, it quintupled its exports, and it tripled its coal consumption. That's what you're seeing right here. All powered by coal. And that's why in 2006, China overtook the US as the leading emitter of greenhouse gases. Next. But right around that time, China's leaders also began to realize that its single-minded focus on growing its GDP was no longer enough to guarantee a good quality of life for its citizens. And that, in fact, its development model based on export, manufacturing, heavy industry powered by coal was simply unsustainable and was leaving a trail of environmental destruction in its wake. Next, please. This all came to head at a crucial year, a turning point, the year known as China's airpocalypse. This was when the pollution in Beijing and other northern cities got so bad, it was as if people were living inside an airport smoking lounge. Studies shown that it was equivalent to every man, woman, and child in Beijing smoking 1.3 cigarettes every hour. People had to wear face masks to go outside. Hospital admissions soared, and an estimated 4,000 people a day were dying from air pollution. 2013, remember that year, because by the public concern rose, especially after the government started releasing data on the amount of air pollution every day. And by the end of that year, China realized it had to do something. It launched a tremendous 1.7 trillion renminbi program, its Air Pollution Action Plan, to targeting coal consumption in its most polluted regions. And that was when NRDC brought together 20 of China's most prominent research institutes, academic organizations, and even industry associations. And together, we advocated successfully for China to include in its current 5-year plan a mandatory national cap on its coal consumption. Next, please. And the results were impressive. After growing its coal use by double digits for a decade, China's coal consumption flattened in 2013 because of China's efforts to cut its air pollution. And then it continued to drop for 3 more years. And because China's carbon footprint is so outsized, when China's CO2 emissions flattened out, so did global CO2 emissions. They plateaued during those years. Next, please. But China's low carbon transition is not easy. This is a big country. China is responsible for half of all coal use, half of all iron and steel and cement production. It's not like the United States. Turning this country around is like steering the Titanic, hopefully away from the iceberg. And during the last couple of years, China's coal use and CO2 emissions have begun to rise again, though nowhere near the level of growth that we have seen before. And why is that? Well, one reason is the slowing economy, which has been exacerbated, but not caused, by the continuing trade war between the US and China. And what that has done was embolden the voices within China calling for it to slow down on that clean energy transition. The voices of stakeholder groups, the smokestack industries, who profit from the business status quo. So what China has done to try to deal with the slowing economy is what worked in the past. Economic stimulus focused on infrastructure development, building more roads, more apartment buildings, whether or not they're needed. This leads to greater demand for iron, steel, and cement, powered by coal-fired power plants. That's why a large part of why we're seeing this going ahead. I see this slowing in growth as an enormous opportunity for China to make the switch that its leaders say it wants to a new normal of slower but higher quality growth. Switch its complete economic model to more service-based economy, all the things it wants to do. But it is a battle going on right now. Next, please. Here's another very big reason why coal consumption has moved ahead. Look at this. One of the chief obstacles that the central government faces, it's funny, a lot of people say to me, well, China's, authoritarian government. When the leaders say jump, everybody jumps. That is not true for anyone who's spent any time in China. The local governments have a saying, the mountain is high and the emperor is far away. So what happened, even as China was fighting its air pollution battles, it also was trying to streamline its heavy, bloated bureaucracy. So in 2014, it decided to delegate the authority to local governments to approve new coal plants, figuring they would know how much were needed. But what they didn't take into account was the fact that local governments for years had been rated solely on how well they grew their local GDP. And most of these provinces, cities, they grew their GDP on the backs of coal. So when they saw this opportunity to build new coal plants, they rushed to approve as many as they could before the government changed its mind. And whether or not they were needed. And most of them were not needed. In fact, what we're finding now is there's an incredible glut of coal plants throughout the country. And part of the problem is also the rules of the grid were written in such a way to make it easy and virtually risk-free to build new coal plants. Because during that economic miracle decade, that's what was needed. So the rules are still in place that give any new coal plant a fixed price and a fixed number of operating hours, regardless of the availability of cheaper and cleaner renewable energy plants. So when the government recognized what was going on and ordered local governments to stop constructing these plants, we're learning from satellite data that many of them continued in secret. But what you're seeing now is the government recognizing they don't need any more new coal plants. And the ones that are going on are very likely going to result in a huge problem of stranded assets when the investors are never going to be able to recover the costs they put into these new coal plants. But that's the battle that we're seeing right now. Next, please. So NRDC is continuing to work with our coal cap team to come up with very practical, detailed recommendations for how China can continue its transition away from coal. And these are a few of the suggestions that we've made, each one listed in a detailed report. And the main one is this power sector reform. That's what's needed here to level the playing field for renewable energy to compete with coal. But our studies show, and those of many other experts, that even though China's coal consumption has gone up, it's probably not going to ever reach the levels it was at before. As I said before, these coal plants are not needed. They're very inefficient. China's starting to close down the worst ones. And we think that if China were to comply or to follow our recommendations, it could probably peak its coal use by as early as next year. That's how close we are. And a lot of that is because, next slide, of the rapid growth of renewable energy in China, which is really making it possible for the first time to really talk about how China can start to truly phase out its reliance on coal. So what China realizes is that clean energy is not only good for the health of its people and for protecting its environment, it's also the largest market opportunity of the 21st century, and China's determined to take the lead. Clean energy also means jobs. And China, believe it or not, leads the world in clean energy jobs. 4 million out of the 11 million jobs worldwide now. And China has more jobs in clean energy right now than in coal mining. Similar to this country. Next, please. But just a lot more. So starting, you asked when was that year of the airpocalypse. Starting in 2013, that was also the year when China overtook the US as the leading investor in renewable energy. And it's kept that crown ever since. In 2017, China poured more money into renewable energy than the next 3 global investors combined, the US, the EU, and Japan. And even last year, which saw a dip in China's investments because it's trying to wean itself away from the subsidies, China still invested nearly twice as much as the United States. Next, please. So all those subsidies, those investments, those policies, those programs, those procurement are really paying off big time because China is now the world leader in wind energy, in renewable energy, in hydropower, and in fact, most forms of renewable energy right now. Next. But the most interesting, exciting story to me is solar power. Because 10 years ago, I remember very well, China had no domestic solar industry to speak of. In fact, if you added up all the power it was generating from solar energy at that time, it would roughly equal what the city of San Antonio, Texas, is producing today. But at the same time, China was the leading exporter and producer of solar panels. It was serving 95% of the world market. But then the 2008 economic recession hit, and countries like Germany, one of China's leading customers, they cut their subsidies, and the bottom fell out of the global market. So China decided, now's the time to set up our own domestic solar market. And boy, did it. And this is where China's expertise and focus on single-minded industrial policy for particular industries really pays off. It declared solar panel a strategic national industry. It poured subsidies into it. It set a guaranteed feed-in tariff for solar energies, renewable energy law, standards for reducing costs and bringing up the quality, you name it. And in 2017, China installed more solar capacity than existed in the entire world 2 years earlier. And that year, it installed more solar than coal, gas, and nuclear combined. And right now, it has 3 times as much solar as we do here in the United States. Next, please. And as I said before, even though what all this has done that I think is another form of climate leadership that we don't think about very often, China's efforts and money have led, and production, scale of production, have cut the cost of solar and wind power for everybody in the world by about 80% in that last decade. That's why solar's moving ahead so fast around the world. And China realized that at this point, the costs are coming down so much it doesn't need subsidies anymore. So it cut the solar subsidies dramatically last year. What that did was cut the price again by another 35%. And some of you may have heard that Trump imposed solar tariffs on imports of solar panels. And so the solar business in the US from China has dropped by 80%. But because the prices are so low, it is booming everywhere around the world. A true solar renaissance. Next, please. So here's what we're seeing. This is the exciting news to me. We are starting to see a tipping point where it is becoming cheaper in certain markets, and we'll soon see this everywhere, cheaper to build new solar and wind plants than to buy the fuel to operate those old coal plants. That's when you see the tipping point. And in certain markets, the next stage is going to be when it's cheaper to do that and to include energy storage so that you don't have to worry, you can provide a stable source of power, even when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. China leads the world in energy storage, battery technology. It has brought down the cost of those by 75% in 5 years. And in China itself, solar power is reaching what they call grid parity. You could sell solar power the same cost of coal power in 11 of its 34 provinces this year. That's the tipping point. That's the energy revolution. Next, please. Last year, China opened up the world's, what this is the world's largest floating solar power plant. And what's it floating on? A submerged coal mine. So to my mind, this is the best symbol of the clean energy revolution. Next, please. But I couldn't resist showing you this one as well. Next, please. Nonetheless, despite all this good news, we are still at a world energy system that is 2/3 fossil fuels. Next, please. But because of all that China has done, it is putting us on a trajectory that many experts say can lead to a world energy system that's 50% renewable by 2050. Next, please. But it's not enough. Not enough. The UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, came out with a blockbuster report last November saying that to protect the climate, we need to reach up to 85% renewables by 2050. So that's what I said at the beginning. We have to accelerate our work beyond which we've ever been able to do before. And as far as China is concerned, NRDC is working hard with China to develop the rules of that grid, a 21st century electric grid that's going to meet the challenge and able to integrate all this new renewable energy. But there's a lot that the US can do. There's a lot that states can do. China is collaborating with California, which is a leader on so many of these renewable energy policies. And I think there's much, much more to be done. And I don't see this as a competition between the US and China. I see this as a competition between solar and coal. Next, please. Another way that China is moving faster than many people may know to push this energy transition along is with electric vehicles. Next. And so beginning in 2013 again, China launched in earnest what we call the moonshot to become the world leader in electric vehicles. And just in that past 6 years, China spent $60 billion in subsidies, procurement, charging infrastructure, R&D for electric vehicles. It's moving so fast. Next, please. You can see how fast China has become the world leader in electric vehicles. And this is something maybe a little hard to take here in the United States, which invented the solar cell. Maybe that was here in Colorado at the National Renewable Energy Lab, who built the first practical electric vehicle. China understands that the electric vehicle is very, very important to its pollution in its cities and to its energy security as well. Next. China also recognizes that it has to electrify all forms of transit and mass transit, and it's doing that. Next, please. The best example is e-buses. China is responsible for 99% of the world's electric buses. Not just in China, but it's selling them all around the world, in this country as well. And over 1/4 of China's buses right now are electric. But that's just the beginning, because many cities have decided, and already, like Shenzhen, that's the hub of China's biggest electric vehicle company, they've already switched their entire bus fleet to electric. They don't wait like we do for switching individual buses when they reach the end of their useful life. They move the entire fleets. And the central government in May issued a new electric bus policy, said that every single local government in the country has to come up with a plan for phasing out its dirty diesel buses in favor of electric. Next. Again, despite all this, and I should say, this is not just limited to China, the benefits of this push. China has once again brought down the cost of electric vehicle batteries, which are 1/3 of the cost, so far and so fast that experts say that within 5 years, some say even 2 years in certain markets, it's going to be cost competitive with the non-electric cars. And NRDC, we now have an oil cap project. Same thing, China's top stakeholder groups and experts working together to come up with a plan. We issued a report a few months ago showing how China could phase out these internal combustion engine vehicles completely by 2030. And I'm very excited to say that just the other day, China announced that it is going to develop such a timetable for phasing out all non-electric vehicles. And they're starting with pilot projects. So we feel very thrilled about that. But nonetheless, again, keep it in perspective. Right now, electric vehicles are still just a tiny percentage of our global car fleet. Next. But because of China's leadership, once again, we're now on a path to reach 50% electric cars by 2050. Next. Is that enough? No. No. IPCC says 65% of all transport should be low or no emission. And again, China, I'm not downgrading all the challenges that China faces to scale up any of these clean energy technologies to where it needs to be. And one of the problems it has is that it has been selling electric vehicles so fast that it hasn't built enough charging infrastructure to keep up with it. Another is it's phasing out the subsidies for electric vehicles because it doesn't need to have them anymore. But now it has to really move that whole segment into a more market-based basis. And so that still is going to be a huge challenge going forward. Next. Finally, I just want to say that China's climate footprint is not limited to what's happening within the country itself. In fact, it is having an outside impact on the climate footprint of many, many other countries around the world through its Belt and Road Initiative. How many people have heard of this? Oh, many of you. Okay, next, please. And for those of you who haven't, this is China's overseas infrastructure investment program, the largest in history, so an estimated $6 trillion they plan to spend in countries around the world. There's about 126 countries right now participating in this Belt and Road program. Together, they comprise 2/3 of the world's population and 1/3 of the world economy. And these Belt and Road countries, excluding China, are together right now responsible for about 28% of global CO2 emissions. That's very similar to what China itself is responsible for. But if this development continues on the path it's on, business as usual path right now, a new study estimates that CO2 emissions from these Belt and Road developing countries could reach 66% of the world total by 2030. And that would smash us through that 2 degrees warming goal of the Paris Agreement. Next, please. China and Japan and Korea are still financing coal plants overseas as part of this. Well, for China, it's the Belt and Road Initiative, but Japan and Korea are doing this as well. This has to be addressed. China now is responsible or has expressed interest in financing nearly 1/4 of the coal plants that are under development outside China. And even last year, 40% of the energy financing in Belt and Road went to coal plants. This is a problem because, as I said before, coal is on the way out, I'm convinced. And so are 100 financial institutions around the world who will no longer finance fossil fuel development. But China is becoming the financier of last resort for coal for many of these countries. Next, please. On the flip side, China investment in renewable energy in these countries is also growing. And China's leadership has said all the right things, that it wants to ensure that its Belt and Road investments are green, adhere to the highest possible standards. But they're also saying that they defer to the standards in the recipient country, many of which leave a lot to be desired. So what we've got here is a situation I've just described, China's success in building the world's largest solar and wind programs, overcoming a number of obstacles, determining when to issue subsidies and how to phase them out. It has a tremendous opportunity to share not only its technologies, but its expertise and experience in clean energy with these Belt and Road countries. This would make an enormous difference in reducing our global climate exposure. Next, please. So NRDC has been asked to join one of the 10 working groups that the government has set up for advisors, to be advisors on the Belt and Road. And our particular expertise, like that of NRDC as a whole, is law, is regulations, is standards. So we've already come out with a number of reports and recommendations. Here's just a few of them on things we think are absolutely essential to ensure that when China finances projects in the Belt and Road, it does so complying with the highest best practices around the world. Next, please. But it's at least as important, if not determinative, to ensure that the recipient country has the highest possible standards, regulations, incentives in place in order to allow that clean energy to be integrated into their system, just like with China. So here are some of the recommendations that we've made for host country as they move ahead with considering Belt and Road financing. And I tell young students who ask me, I'm interested in China and in environmental problems, what should I do? I say, this is going to keep people busy for decades, because to really help requires a knowledge and working with each one of those 126 recipient countries, every one is, which is different. So this is going to be a huge issue and for many years to come, and hopefully we can help with greening that Belt and Road. Next, please. So I have two pictures here of Beijing taken from the window of our office there, 5 days apart. And in one of them, the pollution is so bad, you cannot make out the shape of the buildings that we look out every day. The other one is crystal clear. This is the reality in Beijing today. China is at a crossroads, and the decisions that it makes now on everything from power sector reform to energy efficiency to Belt and Road are going to determine the quality of life for everybody on this planet. Next. And here's another picture I have. This is of my office in Beijing, which has grown from one man with a cell phone to 40 people, lawyers, scientists, conservationists, technical experts, policy analysts, and fellows. They understand that China is at a crossroads, and they are doing everything we can to help address the direction and move China in the right direction. Our energy team, a couple of weeks ago, was asked to make a presentation to China's chief climate negotiator, Minister Xie Jinhua, and his team. And we presented our recommendations, including the fact that China has an opportunity now to strengthen its climate targets in a way that would allow it to peak its CO2 emissions a full 5 years earlier than its current climate pledge, if not even before that. And we told them how. And Minister Xie and his team reacted very favorably to our recommendations. And they also pointed out how helpful our work in this coal cap and oil cap groups were to the future and development of China's climate policy. Next, please. So I want to close with a Chinese proverb that I may have made up. When the winds of change blow, some people build walls, others build windmills. Thank you.
How many of the Belt and Road Initiative countries have also signed up to the targets that China has, and what is the power of China to influence them, and how many have said, yes, okay, we agree with this?
Do you mean the Paris climate pledges? Well, in the Paris Agreement, every signatory country issued their own climate pledge, and they vary. They vary wildly. But the key feature of all of them, that if you take them all together, they won't get us even 1/3 of the way where we need to be to meet that 2-degree warming or 1.5-degree warming goal. So at the time of the Paris Agreement, every country also agreed that 5 years later, which is December 2020, they would strengthen their targets. So many of these Belt and Road countries, a number of them have specific targets for renewable energy already. Many of them don't. But hopefully within the next year, as agreed, these countries will come up with more specific targets that can help drive that investment. Thank you.
So to the Belt and Road Initiative, And this question comes from I think it comes from the proverb you shared earlier, the idea that the mountain is high, but the emperor is far away. And I'm wondering how best it is that we can support host countries in maintaining high standards, especially when China isn't a monolith, right? And there are Chinese forces that I think are working to help promote those high standards, and ones that maybe are working to keep the standards low, like Huawei, for example, in Africa recently, was charged with trying to support certain political factions that might not have the best interest of the country at heart.
Yes, I think it's a bottom-up and top-down requirement. I remember when I started working at NRDC, one of my colleagues had a single-minded quest, this is in the 80s, to get the World Bank to consider the environmental impacts of its loans. There was nothing at the time. That's where China is right now, but a little bit further along. They have a series of guidelines, but none of them are mandatory yet. That's where we have to change. And the good news is, you said yourself, China's not a monolith. And there are leaders in China driving all this change. And there is what we call Mr. Green Finance in China, Ma Jun, who has taken it, he set up China's domestic green finance program, the largest in the world, but he's now taken it upon himself to green the Belt and Road through applying those green finance principles. Guidelines for greening the Belt and Road is one of them. So there's a whole series right now, and that's part of the working group that NRDC is in to try and put some teeth into those guidelines. Yes?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this, so I understand that with the coal-powered plants, there are technology or scrubbers or something that can reduce the carbon dioxide emission. I don't know if it totally does away with it, so that's one question I had. Another question that you didn't talk about is nuclear energy, and I know there's always the talk about the carbon rods and how to get rid of the nuclear waste, and I know what happened in Chernobyl and in Japan. And the other issue, which you didn't talk about at all, is hydrogen-fueled vehicles, which they do a lot of research at NREL, and I think that's even better than electric cars, if you want to know the truth. And then you got the problem with the batteries and the chemicals in the batteries, the lithium and the length of the batteries and how far an electric car can go. So there's a lot of issues that you didn't address. So I'm just curious.
I know,
a lot
30
of questions.
minutes I could only touch the surface, and those are 4 very good questions. I'll try to answer them. The first, and you do sound like an expert, don't tell me you're not. First one, you do, and that's what everybody should do, so good for you. The first question is the carbon capture and sequestration technology, is what it's called. China has been doing research on that. The US used to, but isn't really doing much anymore. They're looking at that in connection with oil wells, where you can pump. What they do is they capture the CO2 from a factory, and then they inject it into the ground, and that helps to recover more oil. So they are looking at that. They only are at the pilot stage still, and the problem is expense. It's horrendously expensive. And we're in a situation now where solar and wind are becoming so cheap, cheaper than just regular coal plants, that it's becoming harder and harder to justify spending all that extra money to keep the coal plants running and capture that CO2. That's what's happening, because China's moving into a competitive energy system. Same is true for nuclear. China's very interested in nuclear, though after the Fukushima accident right next door in Japan, the people were so concerned that China put a moratorium on new approvals of nuclear plants, which lasted until just, I think, a couple of weeks ago. They've started an environmental impact assessment process for 2 of these. But the trouble, again, is that carbon capture in the nuclear, if you look at a graph of expense for clean technologies, those are the 2 most expensive. And China doesn't want to keep subsidizing nuclear, just like it doesn't want to keep subsidizing solar and wind and coal. It wants to get away from that business. And so recently, it announced new tariffs that nuclear plants could obtain, which are much, much lower than people expected. So it's going to be hard for investors to get their money back. Third, you talked about hydrogen fuel technologies. And what I didn't talk about is the godfather of electric vehicles in China is named Wang Gan, who rose up from as an automobile engineer to become China's Minister of Science and Technology, and he pretty much spearheaded everything I've talked about with electric vehicles. He's out of the government now, but he's still a chief advisor on this. He's pushing fuel cell vehicles. That's what he was doing when I first met him. And I think he's got a point that for long-range vehicles, like long-range trucks, ships, and so forth, we may see hydrogen being a more feasible alternative than electricity. And then finally, you talked about batteries storage. Key problem, the life cycle environmental impacts. And that goes from what are the impacts of digging up all the raw materials for use in these batteries, like the cobalt, like the lithium. A lot of this is causing, if it's not done in an environmentally sensitive way, it's causing environmental destructions in countries in South America in particular. China, and if China's going to ramp up electric vehicles, the amount of batteries is going to skyrocket. And then what do you do at the end of their useful life? The disposal problem. China's answer, recycling, battery recycling. It has already started a program to track every battery, vehicle battery. And then they have 4 pilot projects around the country where they're starting with the recycle process. So it's a long way to go, but that's the only solution, is large-scale battery recycling. Thank you.
My question has to do with natural gas, which you also didn't talk about. Mm-hmm. And I know in the U.S., there's been a significant move from coal-fired plants to natural gas plants as a result of natural gas prices falling so significantly in the last 10 years. You also didn't compare the cost of renewables to natural gas. And my question is 2 things. 1, I'm wondering if China's making conversions to natural gas as well. And number 2, what that looks like from a comparison to the renewable costs.
Good questions, good question. So in China, you're talking about the U.S., it's really the fracking of gas that has been enabling this country to reduce its reliance on coal. But fracking is very technically difficult in China because of where the gas is located underground. It's a mountainous region. So they're not really looking at that. They're looking at imports. Their imports of gas and oil are skyrocketing. And they're not happy about that because of energy security implications. But it's interesting to me that all these years, when China has a lot of natural gas itself, it never wanted to use natural gas for power production. It uses it for industrial processes, for heating. Heating is that's where it's a growth industry. And when the pollution got so bad in the Beijing region a couple of winters ago, China pretty much required all local governments to make that switch in people's homes and in small boilers to natural gas. But the pipelines weren't in place, the price skyrocketed, and we had a terrible situation where people froze for most of one winter till they had to step back and do a bit more planning. But that's where the natural gas is going. Not really, they're not looking at natural gas for power production, and they never really have, for whatever reason. Okay.
Oh, I just wondered, what's the source of the electrical generation that's charging all those clean electric vehicles?
Oh, no, very good point. Very good point. Well, right now, when I started working in China, 80% of China's electricity came from coal. And because of this transition, we're now at a situation where it's 67%, over 2/3. So right now, the majority of the electricity used in the electric vehicles is coming from coal-fired power. So you're not saving much CO2 emissions. You are saving a lot in pollution in cities, because ozone is now becoming an even bigger problem. But China's taking the long view here because it is cleaning up its grid. As the renewable energy continues to grow. And they, like I said, they have this non-fossil target of 20%, and that's not including the all the hydropower by 2020. It's continuing to grow. So once as they clean up the grid, there'll be cleaner and cleaner sources of electricity for the vehicles. Good question.
I brought the microphone over here. I've got a question.
Yeah.
You have illustrated for us an energy revolution that's really seems to be spearheaded in China, or certainly growing exponentially in China compared to the rest of the world. What are the changes we need to make in the United States so that we don't end up lagging behind in this revolutionary era?
Very good. I don't think that trying to bring solar panel manufacturing back to the U.S. is the right solution, in part because this process is now largely automated, so it's not going to bring new jobs. Although selling, importing these low-cost panels from China meant that the fastest growing job in the United States for many years until these tariff hits was what? Solar panel installer, maintenance, sales. We can benefit from the solar revolution. But what I think the answer to your question really is innovation. We're still the champs in that. Even though China says it has a growing number of patents, we have the quality patents. You've got NREL right here. I think this way forward for us is bumping up that R&D financing for and startups and getting more innovation. Because what China's doing is producing at scale the current technologies. But we need to keep inventing new, cleaner, cheaper, less environmentally damaging technologies, even for clean energy. That's where our role comes in. And there's a great report by Stanford University called The New Solar System, and they laid it all out, exactly where the U.S. should be going ahead, and cooperating with China on certain things, finding our special niche. There's a lot of opportunities there. And he says it's in the best interest of both countries to work together to scale up this industry to a global level.
As a follow-up question, there's a lot of talk about the coal industry in the United States and what's happening to those jobs and how that's affecting the economy. What advice would you have for that industry?
Yes, I've been reading about that in certain places in this country. They're taking a really innovative approach to retraining people to do things like building retrofits, building energy retrofits. You can't outsource those jobs, and there's a dramatic need for those in both countries. Building CO2 emissions is the fastest growing source of CO2 emissions in China, for sure. So that's where I think the answer lies, because you can't just say, well, here's these clean energy jobs, go get them. You know, a lot of people in both countries don't want to move, right? They don't want to change their way of life, but you can retrain. China actually set aside a $15 billion fund to retrain workers in smokestack industries, which sounds good. I mean, I think they need more of that, especially because apparently most of the money went to paying their back wages, because many of these state-owned enterprises were in such debt.
Yeah, I read Elon Musk's biography, and he has Solar City in California. Yes. Is he leading the charge, and there's other people like him in America leading the charge? So it's not just NREL, which is government, but he's private capitalism.
He's certainly leading the charge on electric vehicles. Solar power, I've read some things somewhat controversial. I won't get into that. But yes, he's opened the first wholly owned foreign factory in China for building electric vehicles. And Beijing exempted Tesla from the import tax because it's still got that cachet. But Elon Musk is building a battery gigafactory, right, in the desert. China is building battery gigacities, like 20 large ones, where everybody in the city works just to produce these batteries. So it's hard to compete on that scale. But again, what's that? Oh, sorry.
Someone said it was smart.
Yeah. But again, room for innovation, no question.
Yeah. Other questions? Oh, thank you.
I've loved your talk. What about the waters of the world? Can you speak to the cleaning water?
Yeah. I personally feel that despite all the attention given in China to air pollution, water pollution is an even more serious issue. And even beyond that, soil pollution. China just passed a soil conservation pollution law, which we helped to draft, but it's going to be a gargantuan undertaking to clean up all the pollution. When they placed factories, chemical factories, next to farmlands and next to schools, I mean, that's where we are right now. And I should say, again, China has a myriad of programs and incentives. It's a huge whole network in place to try and clean up its water. But it's a huge job. It's a huge job. And they're trying to use some of the measures that we were promoting in the electricity industry to try and get China to users to stop wasting water and to use it more efficiently, because China only has 1/7 of the water per capita as the world average. And it's going down fast because the glaciers are melting due to climate change. So they have a problem of water quantity and water quality that is enormous.
Other questions? Oh, yes.
Hi. So oftentimes, like, a policy or regulation is only as good as the enforcement. So can you speak a little bit to the enforcement mechanisms of existing regulations within China and how effective they are and how often they are, when there is violation, like how often do people actually experience consequences, or firms?
Yes, good question. Enforcement is where the rubber meets the road in China. It has a pretty complete system of laws and regulations, but it's a cat and mouse game with the polluters. And that's one of the reasons why China amended its Environmental Protection Law Act in 2015. And it has adapted the system we use in this country. And again, we were one of the ones pushing this for fining violators. Because until that time, there was a one-time slap on the wrist, like a traffic ticket, if a major factory was polluted. But the system now requires that the amount of the fine continues to pile up for every day of violation. So that is an important thing. China also, in that law, set up a whole new system of public interest litigation where China's NGOs can bring suit against polluters. And it's not taken off as much as we had hoped, but there's some really good high-impact cases. What has taken off is China's own system of the procuradorates. This is somewhat analogous to our Department of Justice prosecutors, but they have been bringing thousands of cases against violators and winning almost all of them. So that is a big change that we're seeing. Another change that seems to be rather effective is when the government sends what I call SWAT teams of inspectors around the country to try to check up on them. And again, lots of times these are supposed to be surprise inspections. Somebody gets wind of it. There's a million ways around it. But China does seem to be serious about strengthening its enforcement. When it had a major government restructuring last year, it combined a number of environmental agencies into one huge Ministry of Environment and Ecology, because that is where the enforcement authority lies. So, but it's a work in progress for sure.
Other questions? Yes.
Not to be overly simplistic, but if China seems to be going the right direction, is it just unfair to say that Trump is leading our nation on 90% of these issues in the opposite direction?
Oh, it's absolutely true. It's not unfair at all. He seems to be intent on rooting out all of our climate change and environmental regulations and decimating them. Okay. No, the Clean Power Plan, which was the Obama administration's signature program for reducing CO2 emissions from power plants. He's trying to get rid of that. We are suing him. By the way, NRDC, I said, was formed by a group of lawyers. We have brought suit against the Trump administration because of what he's doing to roll back our environmental regulations on average once every 9 days since he took office, and we've won almost every one so far.
I thank NRDC for doing that as well. What are some of the limitations relating to electric vehicles? You mentioned the need for more charging stations. What about how far you can travel before you need to get recharged? How long does it take to have to before the battery will recharge? What are some of the kinds of practical limitations that exist?
Well, you've named several of them, because the number of charging stations will determine, and the size and quality of the battery will determine how far any driver of an electric vehicle can go before on one charge, right? And so we've got a situation where the state grid company and many private companies are building charging stations as fast as they can. What the problem here is, there's no one single standard for charging and for paying, and some of these charging stations don't work. It's like whenever you look too close at one of these initiatives of China, you see the growing pains. So that's, they have to coordinate better. A lot of times charging stations are put just where there happens to be extra land. That's not where people need them. So there needs to be better planning. There needs to be a better business model where people build the charging station, can recover their investment, and they don't just sit there because they don't work. But China also needs to develop better, it recognizes, it needs to develop batteries that can go further on a charge. So what it's doing now, as it winds down its subsidies to people who purchase electric vehicles, it's now offering subsidies to inventors who can develop batteries that run longer, that are higher quality, higher density. So it's really changing its whole mindset on how to go forward here. The third one is that most of the electric vehicles in China so far have been sold in 6 cities, and they're huge mega cities, but still, these happen to be cities where there's special and non-monetary incentives for electric vehicle purchasers. For example, in Beijing, you do not have to enter a lottery in order to get a license plate where you might have to wait years. Or in Shanghai, where you don't have to pay thousands of dollars to get a license plate. They're being exempt. Just like in this country, where you can ride in the HOV lanes. That's very nice. But there have to be ways to spread out the purchase of EVs so that again, it can mesh with the development of new charging infrastructures and accelerate throughout the country.
Well, we saw a photograph with a whole bunch of electric vehicles, and for those existing electric vehicles, how far can they run, and how long does it take to recharge?
Well, it depends. It really depends. There's dozens of electric vehicle companies in China, dozens. And many of them are going to go under as China withholds the subsidies. So only the best ones are going to last. What I think is another big challenge is that China doesn't really need more cars. If you've ever tried to drive or be in a taxi in Beijing, you'll understand there's no more room for more cars. It's really electrifying the buses and the taxis and the ride sharing. You know, China's answer to Uber, called Didi Chuxing, is electrifying its entire fleet, and it's enormous. And they're building their own charging stations. That's the future, not really the electric cars.
While I'm walking the microphone over here, where do you see geothermal energy in this global future?
China's geothermal, the deep geothermal, is way concentrated out in the western part of the country, in the Tibetan region, deep, below, far away from the demand centers. So it really hasn't taken hold. Again, very expensive to capture that and get it to where it needs to go. But what China is leading the world in is shallow geothermal. And many other technologies that I haven't even begun to talk about. But that's not going to be a big solution for power generation.
I have a question about two of the pictures that you showed. One side by side, one of, I guess it was Beijing, with enormous air pollution, and another that you said was just 4 days later, which was perfectly clear. My family was in Beijing this past summer, and they said the air was terrific. Yes. So how do you explain the difference in just 4 days between those two pictures?
Good question. That picture was taken a few years ago. The Washington Post had an article just last week. Beijing's air quality has improved tremendously. And it's because of those two air quality action plans that I talked about, which really focused on Beijing because that's where all the international attention is. And yes, today you're going to see many more of those blue sky days in China. It really depends upon the time of year and which way the winds are blowing. Beijing's in a basin. So it gets caught, the stagnant polluted air does get caught up from time to time. But what we're seeing a lot of that pollution, it's getting, leaked, we call it, a pollution leakage to other parts of China that aren't as well regulated and populated. But yes, you're right, Beijing is about to drop off of the list of the 200 most polluted cities in the world, and that's quite an accomplishment for China.
Do we have one last question? Yes, there we go. Our last question of the evening.
One aspect of transportation I don't think you touched on was airplanes. And how do we transport these heavy loads that we currently do with petroleum-based power?
Yes. This is the next frontier. Airplanes and ships were not included in the Paris Agreement. And there was some progress being made on an international agreement to cut CO2 emissions from the airplane industry, but it's just getting started. But from the shipping industry, actually that's a project that I've been leading in China for the past 4 or 5 years. China's the largest shipbuilding nation. It also is home to 8 of the 10 busiest ports in the world. And until we got started, all these ocean-going ships were coming right into port and belching out the dirtiest diesel fuel that there is, the bunker fuel. And these are highly polluted cities. And we wrote a report showing the impact of this on Chinese citizens. And over the last 4 years, we've gotten them to develop national regulations where now any ocean-going ship heading into any of China's ports has to switch to lower sulfur fuel within 12 nautical miles, not just where they're at port. And because of that, the International Maritime Organization, which is run by consensus, thanks to China's support, last year announced that this low sulfur fuel regulation starting next January is going to apply to every ship everywhere, whether at port or on the high seas. Everybody's going to have to switch to that low sulfur fuel. So that shows you why China is so key, another example. But now we're starting to move to the next frontier, which is what you asked about. How do you reduce the CO2 emissions from shipping and airplanes? I know shipping better, and we are hosting the first conference in China on this topic in November with the participation and partnership of China's Ministry of Transport. They want to hear about it. They want to know what countries are doing. And actually, it's Hong Kong that's taking the lead here. They are seriously considering moving some of their ferries to electric ones. So hopefully that'll carry on. But there's a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you.